Does it seem like you are constantly battling against your feelings and that more often than not, they get the upper hand? Well, if that's the case for you, I think you are going to really enjoy this video because I'm going to teach you how the most successful business owners manage their feelings. And at the outset, let's talk about what constitutes success. I believe that success, and more broadly, well-being, is simply a matter of you getting and keeping what you want. It's a matter of fulfilling what is most valuable to you. And to the extent that you can get and keep what you want, you're going to experience all of the positive emotions in life. They all depend on getting and keeping what you want. If, however, you are struggling to get and keep what you want, you're going to experience suffering. That's where we have all of the negative emotions of our lives when we fail to get and keep what we want. Now, it's not that you are going to uh, do away with all negative feelings whatsoever, right? These are a part of life. Bad things happen. Nevertheless, I do believe that we can increase the probability of getting and keeping what we want. We can stack the deck in our favor to experience more well-being and more success as we, as individuals, define it. So the most successful business owners at the outset, they're likely the ones who have defined with great clarity what they want. And they have the skills to get and to keep what they want. So if you've not yet defined what it is that you want, I'm going to suggest that your feelings may actually hold a clue. See, a number of researchers have described our emotional regulation system as the central executive function, which is to say that your ability to manage your feelings is responsible for your attention, your working memory, your ability to strategize and execute just about all of the things that we think of as our higher brain functions. They are scaffolded on top of the affect regulation system. In other words, the system that helps us manage our feelings. And if this is dysfunctional, if our feelings are constantly getting the best of us, there is no way we are performing optimally when it comes to these higher executive functions. Other researchers have described the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, as a mechanism for the achievement of goals. So consider this. If you could master the mechanism that's responsible for the achievement of goals, isn't it more likely that you would have a better time getting and keeping what you want? Isn't it more likely then that you would experience more well-being, more success, more fulfillment? I think it's obvious. It's obvious to me. I hope it's obvious to you as well. If we take this seriously, that our emotional regulation system is the mechanism for achievement of goals, that it's responsible for these higher executive functions, then we have much better odds of getting and keeping what we want, of being successful as business owners. So there's a reason that I use the word manage our feelings. This is very different from squashing our feelings. This is very different from just feeling our feelings. This is very different from a whole number of things. I use the word manage specifically because it has an etymological link to hand, manus in Latin. And it has a particular association with the steering of horses. Now, that's a curious thing. The word manage has this link to steering horses, doing so by hands on the reins, yeah? And I think that's particularly fitting when it comes to our feelings, because our feelings, they're the wild aspects of our nature. Quite frankly, we might even consider them as beyond the human. And that's a weird notion. Let me elaborate that for a moment. I'm going to suggest that feelings are more than human, beyond the human, in that we could be consumed by them. They flood us, they enter us from without, and we can be taken over by them despite our best intentions. Yeah. So that suggests that they're not something merely human. They're not trivial forces. No, it takes a steady hand to manage this wild stallion. Yeah. So there's a reason, as I mentioned, that I use this word manage our feelings because we will never fully control them. They are, I'd suggest, beyond total control in that they're surprising, they're unpredictable. Again, they are wild to us. We can steer them, we can manage them, but we will never totally control the animal aspects of our nature. We can manage it though. And when we do so, as I'll come to show you in a couple of moments, this can set us up for much greater success. So our feelings, they contain both energy and information. Our feelings, I often tell clients, tell us what matters, in what way it matters, and to what degree it matters. So if we can connect with our feelings and manage them effectively, we'll have a much better sense of what matters, in what way, and to what degree. Now, here's what I mean by those three things. Something happens in the world around you. In fact, everything is happening all the time around you, but most of the things don't matter to you. There are certain things that happen, certain events that occur that elicit an emotional response. That's a signal that whatever has happened matters to you. That signals what matters. Now, the nature of the emotional response is going to give you some information as to in what way it matters, right? If you are excited about a thing happening, that's very different than if you are enraged by a thing happening or devastated by a thing happening. So an emotional response tells us, this matters. The nature of the emotional response tells us in what way it matters. And the intensity of the emotional response tells us to what degree it matters. I might be bummed if I lose 20 bucks. I might be heartbroken if I lose my beloved. Yeah. The intensity is going to tell me quite a bit about to what degree. So these feelings, again, are potent resources for us if we can connect with them effectively. They tell us what matters, in what way, and to what degree. That's the information component. Now, I mentioned our feelings, they have both information and energetic components. Now, an easy way to understand this is that an emotional activation is simply that it's an activation. It provides a mobilization of us towards some specific end, towards some enactment, let's say. An emotional response potentiates us for activity. So when we are connected to our emotions and able to manage them effectively, this is a bit like having both a GPS and fuel to get us where we want to go. They reveal to us what matters in what way and to what degree. They potentiate us for activity. So then we know what values matter to us. We know how we're situated with respect to those values. Am I excited about the approach to them? Am I angry at the threat against them? Am I saddened by the loss of something I value? Yeah. And then I have energy to take action in accordance with how I am situated with respect to the thing that I value. And this is what the most successful business owners know. Our emotions are not out to get us. They are not in opposition to us. They may, I'll say, they may reveal that we are at odds with ourselves. We're in conflict with ourselves. We may find, for example, that our emotional response compromises our bulletproof, impenetrable, egoic idea of ourselves. I may want to be a strong, stoic, independent kind of guy, unfazed, unbuffeted by the world. And yet, if I am devastated by the loss of a beloved, then maybe that impinges upon my ego ideals. Nevertheless, these feelings can reveal deeper soul values. Now, Let's talk about how we can connect with these things and how we can manage them more effectively. If you're following along so far, I'm going to assume that you're on board, that these ideas are not too far out there. And this makes a kind of logical sense. It makes, frankly, a psychological sense. So, how do we then manage our feelings if we want to be successful as business owners? I mentioned that managing, steering these wild horses, is not crippling them or squashing them. That's not an effective way to treat an animal, right? You want to make use of and develop an ongoing relationship with this animal. Crippling the thing isn't effective management. Likewise, if you're a business owner and you have a team of employees, squashing them isn't effective management of your human capital. Yeah. So managing means curtailing the energies, directing the energies of this thing, putting the energies toward intentional use. Hence the information value of our feelings. That's how we bring intention to this. But I'll suggest that there are three main components when it comes to effectively managing your feelings as a business owner. The first is to take stock of the label of what you're feeling. So let's say something happens. Okay. How do you feel with respect to that something? Can you effectively label what it is you are feeling? And I'm going to encourage you to stick with the primary feelings here. You could be excited about a thing. You could be angry about a thing. You could be saddened by a thing. You could be frustrated by a thing. You could be irritated by a thing, perhaps. I think you get the idea. Maybe you don't, actually. This tends to be somewhat confusing for people. But you want to label the feeling first and foremost. And I'll make a note to say the feeling is separate from the trigger of the feeling or the action or event that occasions the feeling. So, for example, hurt is not a feeling. Betrayed is not a feeling. Upset is not a feeling. These are triggers. A good indicator here is that if you're using a past participle, we'll say that most of the time, not always, because frustration is an experience, but usually if you're using a past participle, you're referring not to a feeling, but to the trigger of the feeling, the event that occasions the feeling. So someone may have hurt me. Someone may have betrayed me. Someone may have upset me or disappointed me or rejected me or whatever. How do I feel with respect to the fact that they hurt, betrayed, upset, etc., me? A lot of people have a tough time with this because we have been culturally conditioned not to feel or to consider feelings as embarrassing, anxiety provoking, shameful, all of this. There is nothing shameful about being angry with respect to the fact that someone disrespected you or betrayed you or hurt you. That's quite frankly a normal emotional response. Now, here's where we can draw another important distinction. And this is the second key step of managing your feelings. You want to distinguish between the trigger and the feeling. You want to label the feeling. And you want to connect with the experience of the feeling in a bodily sense. Now, here's the important distinction. Experience is not the same as expression. And I used the example of anger a few moments ago. A lot of people trip when it comes to anger because they're afraid. They confuse the experience of anger with the expression of anger. Well, I've seen people be angry in the past, and it always leads to destruction and ruin, people screaming and hitting the wall and throwing dishes. These are expressions of anger. That is different from the experience of anger. And I'll stick with anger as the example. Let's say something happens in the environment. Anger reveals that something I value has been compromised. So how do I feel with respect to it? Can I label the feeling as anger? Okay. Can I then connect with the experience separate from the expression? Yelling is an expression of anger. Punching a wall is an expression of anger. Withdrawing into sullen depression is an expression of anger. Telling the other person, hey, what you did made me angry. That's an expression of anger. Yeah. So if we can distinguish between the expressions and the experience, we can then connect with the experience. We can honor the, the truth of our experience, and we can make a decision as to whether or not and in what way we then express what we experience. So we label the feeling. That is the first step of managing your feelings. Labeling the feeling effectively activates certain cognitive resources that help you mentalize. In other words, you start to think about your feelings. You develop both comprehensive and apprehensive knowledge of the situation. When you can activate your thinky bits and your feely bits equally and get them talking to each other, you are effectively managing your feelings. So you label it. You connect with the embodied experience. Anger, for example, is characterized across the human species by a flush of warmth. It's a heat building somewhere here in the midsection. It rises. It potentiates us. We feel this surge of energy moving through our bodies. It readies us for a fight. Now, whether we throw a punch or not is a separate matter. Connecting with the experience of anger gets you in closer touch with the energy and the information that the feeling provide. You can then manage that energy in accordance with the information toward getting and keeping what you want. So when we can label the emotion and experience it in its fullness, then we have the opportunity to imagine the feeling. And this, I want to say, this is where a lot of body-oriented practitioners get it tragically wrong, let's say. The point of feelings is not to feel them. The point of feelings is not to cathart them and express them and smash them in a rage room or just to go scream in the wilderness. A lot of body-oriented practitioners sadly think that the point of feelings is to feel them. And that is, frankly, not psychological. That's something more like applied physiology that says, boy, I have this stimulus and this response, and I need to discharge the response to get back to neutral. This is what often happens with cathartic approaches. You build up a lot of feeling, you go to the smash room and you break things, you scream in the woods, and it feels good short term. You've discharged that energy. But have you actually put that energy to any use? Quite frankly, no. You may have felt the feeling, but you haven't really learned from it. You haven't put it to use. So you've taken all of that energy and you've just discharged it. It's the same thing when clients will talk about, oh, I went to the gym to burn off steam, or I went to a boxing class, or I went to jujitsu and I took it out on the mat. Okay, fine. You may have had this short-term release of the energy that was otherwise too difficult for you to manage, but you haven't actually channeled that energy to remedy the situation. So if you have no better option than to discharge the energy, maybe that's better than taking it out on whoever it was that angered you. The more effective thing to do, though, if you are angered in a relationship, let's say, is to channel that energy constructively to reshape the structure of the relationship. If your spouse disrespects you and you're angry in response and you go take it out at the gym, have you given your spouse any of that information or energy? Have you brought that energy and information into the relationship that occasioned the anger? No, probably not. You've gone and smashed it in the smash room, screamed in the wilderness. So anyway, I digress. Clearly, I have some feelings about that phenomenon. Those feelings are frustration and irritability, and yes, anger, because in the long term, those things are detrimental. I won't get carried away. You label the feeling first and foremost. You connect with the embodied experience. And rather than discharge the feeling or just feel the thing, the important step is to imaginarize it. Now, that is a weird word. You might think that it's made up. It actually comes from a translation of the work of Félix Guattari. He's a French anti-psychiatrist, and one of his translators came up with this word, imaginarize. It's akin to another word also made up by another French guy, come to think of it, Henri Corbin, who developed the term imaginal. So this is not make believe. This is not pretend. This is not imaginary. When we imaginarize a feeling, we root the feeling into the image that the feeling calls forth. This is a very nuanced kind of thing. I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds. I'm going to say for the time being, when you connect with the bodily experience of a thing, you feel the rush of anger, you feel the heaviness of sadness, you feel the bouncing buzz of excitement. The question is, what does this lead you to imagine? What does this feeling lead you to imagine? What does this feeling ask of you? What would satisfy this feeling? These questions can get you engaged in the process of imaginal work. You can imaginarize the feeling rather than simply play pretend and get lost in your imagination. I'll make another video later on distinguishing between imaginary and imaginal. For the time being, consider, what does this feeling in its embodied experience lead you to imagine? What would satisfy this feeling? Separate from you, let's say. What does this feeling ask of you? What does it ask for? You can see that this starts to personalize your feelings, treating them as persons, as autonomous entities. Yeah? And they direct us toward an image of their fulfillment. Now, that image of fulfillment entails some action. I mentioned before that our feelings activate us toward a certain enactment. There's an impulse associated with them. The impulse of sadness might be to cry. The impulse of anger might be to hit. The impulse of love might be to embrace, any number of things, right? So you can imagine the enactment of these things. And that is separate from acting it out. This is an important distinction too, and this is frankly key to managing your feelings effectively. Distinguishing between a thought or an imaginal activity and a literal physical enactment of the thing makes a world of difference when it comes to managing your feelings. People will shy away from the imaginal because they'll confuse it with the literal. Oh my God, I'm a horrible person if I think about punching my mom. My beloved was telling me this the other day. I can't believe I thought about punching her. It's like, wow, did you actually punch her? No. Okay. So there is a difference, and it's a big difference between imaginal enactments and literal enactments. Part of the reason people suppress their feelings is because they can't make this distinction. They imagine to themselves that thinking about a thing is the same as doing a thing. And I wish you would be logical. Clearly, those are different things, right? So the guilt of imagining a thing it's misplaced. Now, if you did the literal thing, maybe that warrants some guilt, right? You probably don't want to go around punching people in the face every time you're angry. Imagining the thing, though, is very different. Here's where it gets important. I'll share a story distinguishing between imaginal and literal. I was taking a long day out in the desert sometime last year. I had gone on a bit of a visioning experience for myself. And I was walking back into town. This was, long walk out into the desert, walk back into the desert, or walk back in from the desert. And as I was walking back in, there's this hillside of dry brush. And the image occurred to me and said, I could light this hill on fire. I could see houses up on the top of the hill too, and I imagined, oh, if I just lit a match, I had matches with me. I'd only smoked one cigarette. I could light a match. I could set the hillside ablaze. I could watch these houses burn. I entertained this whole imaginal experience. I worked and elaborated the fantasy itself. Here's where it gets important. I realized the destruction that I was capable of, and I realized how powerful I am for suspending that impulse. So this, I do believe, is of the utmost importance. It is far better to know what you are capable of, to be capable of monstrosities, and suspend those things, than it is to be incapable altogether. I would much rather know that I am capable of violence and make a deliberate decision to suspend my violent impulses than to be utterly incapable. This, by the way, for those of you who might be biblically minded, is a better way to interpret the word meek. The meek who shall inherit the earth, they're not the timid, the weak, all of these. These are people who know what they're capable of and choose to suspend what they're capable of. That's a better understanding from what I've gathered through research of the word meek. Anyway, I digress. When you have labeled the feeling and connected with the embodied experience of the feeling and have imaginarized or worked out in fantasy the enactment of the feeling, you have a much better sense of what you're capable of. You have a much better sense of the options available to you. All right. Like, let's say that you're angry at someone and you can imagine pummeling them to a bloody pulp. You know what you're capable of, but there is a wide range of options between beat them to a bloody pulp and withdraw into sullen silence. Yeah. Like, maybe the more appropriate option is somewhere in the middle of the two. I don't need to beat myself up in an internalized depression. I don't need to beat them up in a naive enactment of my anger. Maybe somewhere between the two, I could say, you know what? You made me angry when you did that, and I would really appreciate it if you never did that again. That's an expression of anger, but we only know what we're capable of when we can imagine what we're capable of. Hence the real importance of this last step. When you know the outer limits of your capability, you introduce a whole range of options for the fulfillment of your values. And this is what the most successful business owners know. When they commit to labeling, experiencing, and imagining their feelings to the utmost, they have more information and more energy available toward the fulfillment of their deepest values. This is ultimately what makes them so successful. And this, I'll suggest, is what can make you more successful as well. So, if you find that you are constantly battling with your feelings, I'm going to encourage you to do this instead. First, recognize what happened. What's the fact of the situation that's got you feeling all these feels? Then, can you label what you feel? Can you connect with the embodied experience of what you feel? Can you notice the way that it activates you for particular activity? And then can you work through in fantasy what it asks of you? What would satisfy that feeling? When you can elaborate that fantasy, you will have a much clearer sense of the whole range, the whole spectrum of options available to you. You are then in a much better position to make a deliberate choice toward the fulfillment of your deepest values. And again, that, I'm going to suggest, is what's going to make you most successful, because that is how you are going to get and keep what you want more effectively. So, I hope this video is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments down below. Otherwise, I will look forward to speaking to you again very soon.